If you've ever tried watercolor pencils and ended up with streaky washes, muddy colors all over, or you just couldn't figure out how to make them look as good as regular watercolors, you are not alone. Watercolor pencils can be frustrating when you don't know the right techniques. But today I'm gonna help you fix that, and I'm gonna share the only 3 exercises you'll ever need to master this medium so you can get those smooth washes, perfect blends, and jaw-dropping details. And you'll see it is not as hard as you may think. Hi, I'm Françoise. Welcome back to my channel, your resource for watercolor and watercolor pencil art. Before we start, I recommend the All Brush Durer watercolor pencils by Faber-Castell. To me, they're the best of the bunch because they will give you great results along with some other ones I've talked about in a video I'll link at the end of this one if you want to watch it next. And it's important because some watercolor pencils can feel dry, colors very weak, that might affect your experience and outcome, so it's better to be aware of that. The main technique that comes to mind when thinking about watercolor pencils is to just color like we would with a regular colored pencil and then activate the paint with water. But here's the truth. There are better ways to use them in a lot less time and with much better results. And let me show you what I mean. So this is the old standard way to do it. Color and then activate the paint. It works, and I'll even show you that in some cases, this is the technique that you'd want to go for. But for something like a background or large washes of paint, it's very time consuming, and if you're not using a good quality of watercolor pencils, you are more likely to see streaks beneath the blending paint. This used to be my pet peeve about watercolor pencils. I think it's the case for many of us, but it's easily fixable. To achieve a smooth, professional looking wash without spending a bunch of time, coloring, activating, layering, and fixing streaks, you can use 2 different techniques that are way better. So the first one is the swatch technique. Instead of coloring directly on your paper, you can create a swatch on a palette or a scrap watercolor paper if you don't have one, and you can activate that with water and use it just like watercolor paint. This is going to give you a smooth and even base without the grainy pencil strokes. In the comments of my previous videos, many people asked me before, what exactly is the point of using watercolor pencils in that way and not traditional watercolor then? And they're right, because there's an even better, faster, and more fun way to use your watercolor pencils to achieve a similar result. A brand new technique I've developed recently, and some of you guys already watching the channel loved it, is the pigment grading trick. Just grate the watercolor pencil pigment onto the paper like I'm doing here with plain sanding paper, smear it on the sheet, and activate that with water. You can do it with a brush or you can do it with a spray bottle. Just depends on the result that you're looking for. This is the easiest way to paint smooth washes, and it is fun. This exercise or the swatching technique are important and good to know about because that's how we would start most paintings, especially when we want to paint a background and we're looking for easy to paint washes that are gonna look smooth. First, we paint a base layer, and then we could even add a second one after the first has dried, if we wanted to add depth and vibrancy. It applies to landscapes most of the time, but also to still life, like it is the case here with this clock, or even a portrait, if there's a background, or you just want to block in your main colors super quickly. So as you can see, for this specific project with the clock, I chose to grate the pigment and I used a spray bottle for fun effects. I decided 1 layer was enough, but I still added a little bit of turquoise and some water-soluble graphite for subtle shadows. And it's what is so cool about this technique is that you can both have a pencil and watercolor effect in one background. And just so you know, doing that just took me under 10 minutes, and thanks to the precision of blending everything with my fingers, I didn't even have to bother masking the clock that I had drawn. This painting is available on my Patreon, so if you'd like to join and paint along and access a bunch of other watercolor pencil tutorials for a small monthly fee, head over to the description of the video afterwards to find the link to that. That was just the first exercise, and notice how cool this hybrid pencil and watercolor texture actually looks. Now let's tackle the most confusing part about watercolor pencils, which is blending without making a mess. And that is what I think is holding most people back from even persevering and learning how to use those pencils. But here's the secret. It's all about water control, except that with watercolor pencils, it's a lot quicker and easier to master than traditional watercolors. Most of us have no idea how to tackle that when we begin, and here is what it looks like. This is an old video of mine showcasing my son painting his first watercolor pencil art with all the natural beginner mistakes that come with it. It happened to me too when I started, and you've probably noticed that for yourself as well. The blending is either too messy because too much water and paints get out of control, they all mix up in a giant muddy mess, or it's too dry and it ends up looking patchy and unnatural. This step would occur with the main subject in your painting, like the clock in mine. For that kind of stuff, you'd want to use this famous technique, coloring and then activating the paint. And it's particularly relevant for a subject in focus because we want it to pop with more vibrancy in the colors, more precision, and more detail. So not only coloring directly with the lead on the paper is going to give you more control, but the pressure can also help get those stronger and more vibrant colors quicker. What has worked best for me is to first fully color the main subject as if you were doing a detailed pencil drawing, as if you weren't planning to activate the paint at all, meaning that the coloring itself should make the subject look finished or almost finished, with all the main colors and the main shadows already in place, just like I'm doing here with a light silver color and a darker gray color. I activated that, and I'm going to explain how in a second. And then I chose to add more shadow with a water-soluble graphite pencil this time. A big tip when coloring is to make sure that the pencils aren't extremely sharp in this stage, because the sharper they are, the longer it's going to take to cover some ground on a blank sheet. And the more likely you are to indent the paper as well and leave lines and streaks. I also like to color with elongated circular motions for a smoother result. I don't press too hard, especially in bare areas like this one. This part of the clock is also supposed to stay light, so the last thing I want are scribbles showing after blending the paint. When you have that, instead of flooding the area with a wet brush, wet your brush normally, then dab off excess water on a paper towel before touching the pigment. That is the trick. The brush should feel just damp, no more. This keeps the colors rich, and more importantly, it stops them from spreading into unwanted areas. To manage the blending of dark and light pigments all in one go, I find it smarter to wet the lighter area first and then wet the dark pigment so it naturally melts into the lighter tones and form a natural gradient that you don't even have to worry about. Another super important tip you need to know is to work on small sections with a specific watercolor technique. To activate the whole thing, but bit by bit, not try to do it all at once everywhere. And when you do this, you want to frequently clean your brush to avoid dragging pigment where it doesn't belong. Don't forget to do this often, and always remove the excess water from the brush. Because imagine the mess if the brush was dripping wet, that you never cleaned it while at the same time trying to blend everything at once. Colors would all melt into each other randomly, and the outcome would look nothing like your coloring. It would just be a big mess of a bunch of colors that have mixed together, and you know that when that happens, you end up with muddy colors. Now we have a beautiful background, a fully colored subject, and there are no streaks in that dreamy turquoise background, and no mess on the clock, even though there are a lot of dark colors there. Just fine lines, dark shadows, and crisp highlights. I want to stress the fact that watercolor pencils allow you to take your time, and this is actually a lot easier than traditional watercolors. As long as you follow my tips, you'll see how fun and simple that is. And it's time to take this to the next level with another exercise to add realism, details, and texture, because as you can see, this painting isn't quite finished. Even if you get smooth washes and great blending, the painting's not going to be complete if it lacks in terms of contrast, shadows, and highlights, and all the colors in between. And this is also where watercolor pencils shine, because there are a lot of techniques that you can use to achieve that, and they're all super fun and simple to use. I'm going to demonstrate that right now. For example, a tip for you, if you only need a color boost in a specific place, is to just wet the tip of your pencil with a brush and go glaze that color over the desired area to bring more vibrancy and life into it in seconds. It's what I did on the widest part of the clock, as this technique comes in handy often and it can help you master this exercise. Remember, however, that with this exercise, what we want to focus on is not necessarily the vibrancy, even though it's always a plus. It's going to be the shadows and the highlights. And it's what I did here with my darkest touches added to the clock at this stage. I also took advantage of that to improve the shadows I had painted before. I recommend a water-soluble graphite pencil for this. This is a 6B, but even 4B would work, and 8B is even darker. I use it a lot. You may also use a dark blue or whatever dark color you think will fit your painting best. I like water-soluble graphite pencils because the higher the number is, the darkest and softest the pigment is, and they're really fun for shadows. Notice that in this phase, I work with sharp leads, unlike the coloring phase where I didn't care to use pencils that were more on the blunt side. Because here, the difference is that a fine tip lets you add crisp lines, fine details, and get into nooks and crannies of the painting. And this is much safer to do once the base is down already, the main colors are there, and you just want to add touches. You now have the choice to either blend this like I showed you with the second exercise, or just leave those dark additions alone. Activating pigment will always bring out the color a little more, so it's up to you to decide. Sometimes it's better to keep subtle shadows, sometimes it's better to make them stronger. In this specific painting, I needed to draw the Roman numerals, and it needed to be not only precise but also dark. And I could have decided to use that technique where you just wet the paper first and then you draw on it with your pencil and the pigment activates itself automatically. But instead, I decided to do it differently. I just wet the tip of the lead. I made sure it was not too full of water, and I applied the already wet pigment directly where I needed it. All in all, I found that this was more relevant for me than trying to activate tiny lines with a paintbrush. My favorite way to finish adding realism is with the highlights and some sense of texture as well. And you'll see that watercolor pencils can do both at once. Again, dip a bright or a white pencil directly into water like I just did with water-soluble graphite. And then when you press the lead on paper horizontally and press harder this time, you'll notice you'll get chunky bits of melted pigment on, and it's a game changer to enhance the art because it's crisp and it's noticeable. It even goes on top of dark areas really well. The difference with the way that I drew the numerals is that there I was not using the tip because I wasn't looking for very fine detail, and I was pressing much harder to get those chunky pigments to stick on paper. If you go too far, like I did here, the highlight was a little bit too big, too close to the edge, you can correct it like I'm doing now with my dark 6B graphite by just coloring over it. And that's still life, that's just a clock with a beautiful background, but it's basically how I would tackle any type of painting that I do with watercolor pencils. So if you have tried any of the exercises before, please let me know in the comments below. And if you want to check out my favorite brands, watch this video next. You may also join my Patreon for practice in real time with my voiceover. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time!